Chapter 21, The Hunt Buggy, Hunting 72, Flow. After that disastrous hunt trip in 1971, every time John Rogers and I met, at least twice a week, we discussed the pros and cons of building a hunt buggy, and the more we talked, the better it sounded. We finally made a firm decision to do it. The requirements were rather specific: four-wheel drive, no tracks, light enough to carry on a trailer behind a pickup truck, strong enough to carry about 1.5 tons, room for several passengers, plenty of ground clearance, and the agility to negotiate all those water holes, bogs, stumps, and rocks without difficulty. If this sounds a little tough, then you might recognize just how unsure we were of success. We reasoned that any farm tractor would have a head start on the best of car or truck designs, and there were several makes and models made specifically for cultivating row crops, such as corn, tomatoes, beans, peas, etc., built to straddle one or more rows and consequently high off the ground in the center. We were fortunate to find two rear-end assemblies, one at Fulton, one at Caledonia, both the same model of Alice Chalmers, identical in design and gears with transmission already built in. Total cost, under $50. Our intention was to start building our buggy using one assembly going forward and the other one going backwards with some kind of motor in between to drive both assemblies, hopefully in the same direction. You might find it hard to believe that two grown men, both with a fair knowledge of machinery, could possibly come up with a unanimous decision that it was necessary to reverse the drive in one assembly to have them both go in the same direction. You guessed it, after a lot of mechanical work to put the pinion on the opposite side of the crown gear, reassemble the whole thing, only to find that now we have them going in opposite directions. Oh well, do it again, at least we know we are right this time. John and I had more arguments than the League of Nations, with plenty of chalk drawings on his shop floor to prove a point. But I must say that the above mistake was the only step backwards in the entire building program. I have never built anything before or since that went together one step at a time more gracefully. We fully decided that the steering system should be the articulate type. That is to say, each rear-end assembly should carry about half the total load, and by means of a series of ball joints somewhere between front and back, allow them to change from an inline position to at least a 45-degree angle. Glenn Reitenhouse of Jordan Station near Vineland, Ontario, operated a small manufacturing plant. His principal product was spray machines for fruit growers, a real genius in the new idea department, and a good friend. He had already built this type of vehicle and had no qualms about telling us of the pitfalls and hazards of such a system. His advice saved us many mistakes, and his several visits to John's shop cut our thinking time by half. He also sold us a 10-year-old Volkswagen motor, transmission and rear end for a paltry $35. That motor fit in between those two tractor rear-end assemblies like a glove. We removed the spider gears in the Volkswagen rear-end differential and replaced them with a solid sleeve which gave us a positive drive in both front and rear tractor assemblies. Of course, the motor was mounted crossways in our mud buggy to allow us to line up the Volkswagen rear axles with the drive shafts of the tractor assemblies. We also replaced the standard 9-inch by 26-inch tractor wheels with much larger 14-inch by 24-inch wheels and tires. The wheels from O'Neill International Harvester Dealer in Binbrook and the used tires from Ace Tire in Vinemount, another $40. To operate our jackknife-type steering, we took the power steering pump from an old Cadillac car and the hydraulic cylinder from a discarded bulldozer, plus a push-pull hydraulic valve, welded an extra V-belt pulley on the front of the Volkswagen motor, and we now had a no-steering wheel vehicle that would turn with the little effort required to push or pull the control valve. A fair cry from the impossible levers of the Bren gun carriers. 4 universal joints, 2 on each side of the Volkswagen, allowed the 2 sections of the machine to be turned from an inline position to a reasonable angle, and also permitted any of the 4 wheels to climb over obstacles that were not higher than 2 feet, without exerting any extra strain on any part of the total machinery. A decided bonus that we had not anticipated was the equal weight distribution to each wheel regardless of turning or climbing obstacles. In fact, we wasted our time arranging individual brakes on the front section of the machine. They were just not necessary. It must have been mid-March before we had completed the basic framework, and quite naturally we were most anxious to find out if it would work. The motor started easily and ran well, so we put the tractor transmission in its lowest gear, the Volkswagen in reverse gear, and released the clutch. Nothing seemed to happen. Great Scott! The clutch must be shot. Half-hour later we learned that the gearing was so slow that motion was not perceptible. It took 20 minutes just to back it out of the shop, but once outside, we were not long finding that the faster gears in the tractor transmission would move the buggy at a reasonable rate. It worked out this way. 3 gears in tractor transmissions hooked up in series with the 4 gears of the Volkswagen transmission gave us 12 gears forward and 3 reverse gears. What a powerhouse! In actual operation, we found the top speed to be less than 9 miles per hour in the fastest gears, and a choice of 11 slower combinations of gears for almost unlimited power. On the front half, we built a seat, the full width of the machine, 6 foot 8 inches, to carry the driver and 3 passengers ahead of the wheels and a square motor cover that could accommodate another 3 men. On the rear half, a platform 6 foot 8 inches wide by 8 foot 2 inches long, complete with 2 1-foot-high sides and a flip-down tailgate. All in all, a thing of beauty. This was not really completed until well into the spring, and of course by this time, farm work is too demanding to allow much experimenting. By midsummer, John had a gallbladder attack which required surgery, and when the 1972 hunt season rolled around, he had not recuperated enough to go with us. What a disappointment for all of us. Our hunt meeting proved that, for one reason or another, only 8 could make the trip that year. Bing Harris and his son Bob, Ellis Corman and his son Jack, Ira Lee and myself, Kent Stewart, and a new member, Ed Ascott, who volunteered to be cook for that year. Ed was to drive his station wagon and take 2 others. Bing and Bob's pickup truck would take off from St. Jacobs, which was 30 miles closer to our destination. We had to rent a trailer to carry the mud buggy, and I had to build a hitch onto my truck to pull it. Ellis was to ride with me, Jack was to come sometime on Thursday. So here we go, with a machine that has not been proven beyond climbing a few short hills, plus 5 or 6 trips over the farm. Most in the group were extremely skeptical of its ability, and what's worse, I was the only one who had any knowledge of its operation or construction. The trip to Lost Channel was without incident, and we made rather good time. You may well imagine the jovial discussion as we transferred the Benny boxes and personal gear from the truck to the mud buggy, and the wild guesses as to how far we would actually get before it conked out or became stuck beyond recovery. The first half-mile of our road was probably in the best condition, and as we assembled along at 5 or 6 miles per hour, jokes and conversation flowed back and forth freely, because not even the most skeptical person anticipated any trouble as long as the good traveling lasted. It was most interesting to notice how the tune changed as we successfully went through each mud hole with absolutely no hesitation. In fact, everyone except Ellis and Bob stayed on board until we approached the big one on the power line, where we were stuck with the red Bren carrier the year before. Here they abandoned ship and left Ira and me to go it alone. You may be sure that we examined every possible route before deciding to skirt that miserable hole and gamble on making it through all those stump holes, rocks, logs, and water. I put the machine in a much lower gear and we went across that power line a yard at a time with all the caution of an old hen walking on her own eggs. It was necessary to back up twice in order to make a sharper turn, but other than that, there were no problems. Considering the ups and downs and the turns from right to left and back again, it would take an agile snake to follow our trail without breaking his back. The mud buggy performed in a manner that exceeded all of our wildest dreams, and we attacked each succeeding water hole with a little more confidence. By the time we reached camp, we were ready to tackle any type of obstacle with not the slightest doubt of success. Travel time was 1 hour and 45 minutes, a far cry from the 3 days of the previous year. Jack Corman was in the midst of an electrical engineer's course at Waterloo University and consequently unable to be with us for the famous first mud buggy trip. In fact, he was probably pushing pretty hard to steal a few days from a busy schedule. Nevertheless, he made that 5-hour trip by car to Lost Channel and from there proceeded to walk the 4 miles to camp carrying gun, ammunition, and a full backpack. I doubt anyone else in our camp would attempt this grueling trip in daylight, and certainly not in the middle of the dark night with only a small flashlight to show the way. Well, he made it before 3 o'clock a.m., and I'm sure he must have been happy to stretch out on a bunk and rest until daybreak. I can't remember whether he waited to eat breakfast with the gang or just grabbed a bite and took off. I do know he was the first man in the bush. Ira, Ed, and myself were the last to get ready and were just about to leave when a loud knock on the front door made all of us wonder, who the hell is that? I opened the door to see Jack standing directly in front of me, grinning from ear to ear and with a small deer draped over his extended arms. My surprised expression must have been ample reward for his efforts as he dumped the deer on the doorstep like an armful of firewood and braced himself for the question and answer period which followed immediately. It turned out that he had carried the thing almost a half-mile, shot it in an area we had covered daily since the opening day, and was the first game of the season. Ed Ascot had missed a deer and also bowled over a timber wolf with a charge of SSG from his shotgun, 9 pellets of .22 caliber, at the Old Faithful flume. The others had covered miles of territory and had nothing more than a couple of impossible shots. Jack was our hero of the year after about 2 hours in the bush. Saturday night, about 6 inches of snow fell to change the bush to a winter wonderland. Beautiful, but wet. Sunday morning, we removed the canvas covering the motor and seat of the mud buggy, shoveled the snow from the cargo platform, and loaded it with all of our goods to head for home. Our spirits were soaring high in the clouds as we steamed through all those rotten mud holes with reckless abandon and were able to cut our travel time to less than 1 hour. We called in at the Brit restaurant and service station for an early dinner, and Ed parked his station wagon in the parking area at the foot of a slight grade. The whole large area was blacktopped, and his wagon was at least 40 yards from the nearest car, he thought, out of harm's way. Another customer drove right into the parking lot at the top of the grade, got out of his car, and came in to sit at the table. He forgot to apply the emergency brake or put the car in gear, and we all watched helplessly through the large plate glass window as his car steadily gained momentum backwards down the grade to crash right into the side, dead center, of Ed's wagon. Fortunately, the man was well covered by insurance, and there was no doubt about liability. There were certainly plenty of witnesses. We could hardly wait to get home and report to John, and as we all sang the same tune of praise for our beautiful mud buggy, he seemed to be only mildly impressed. Partly because he had been as skeptical as anyone, and partly because he figured we were laying it on pretty thick. There were only 2 things to do: replace the copper lines we had used for the power steering, which we knew were only temporary with regular hydraulic lines, and also build a roof over the passengers to prevent us from being soaked with snow from the overhanging tree limbs on the trail. Not another thing could be improved. Think about this. Every car manufacturer has a full staff of engineers, designers, and draftsmen working from year to year to put a new model on the road. After 70 years of experience, they are still recalling nearly every year's model to change some malfunction or fault. How then is it possible that 2 average guys could come up with a machine as good as our mud buggy on the first try? There just had to be a lot of luck involved. Florence Louise DeWitt continued nursing at the General Hospital in St. Catharines after her graduation in 1962 for the following 2 years. During the first year, she became deeply involved with one of her patients who had been seriously injured in an accident, which drastically disfigured his face. His name was John Young, originally from the East Coast and currently employed as a sailor on the Great Lakes. He was a quiet, reserved man with little education or ambition, and his inferiority complex was compounded by the disfigured face. Consequently, what started as sympathy soon developed into a full-fledged love affair. Flo had her own motel-type apartment on the 7th Street about 4 miles from the hospital, and when he was released, most of their time was spent together while he was recuperating. It was not too long before they decided to get married, and now the trouble started. John's Catholic faith was strong enough that he insisted that Flo should join his faith, and Flo, being a strong-willed person, was quite adamant about some of the church's rules and beliefs. Flo had many discussions with the local priest and tried desperately to fall in line with his teachings. She even invited him to our home for evening dinner, which turned out to be friendly but rather tense. Most of the conversation related to religion, but when it switched around to hunting, he was then traveling in my territory. I was surprised to learn that he had spent some time in the Eau Claire area, not too far from the Gates farm, where we had bunked in the chicken house. The story he had told about the moose passing him by as he stood in the darkness, flashlight, and gun in hand, deep in the bush and far from camp, was even more surprising. It is not likely that I will ever know whether he was ignorant of the hunting laws or did not care. The love affair was doomed to failure as the gap between them grew larger, and finally Flo called it quits. It was during this period that she met Charlie Boyd, the assistant minister of Knox Presbyterian Church. Well, here goes another whirlwind courtship, and I guess we all thought everything was for the best, even though he was catching her on the rebound. I would suspect that the relief from religious arguments alone was enough to do the trick, but add to this a well-educated, quick-witted, red-headed Irishman, and there was just no doubt. Within a few weeks of their first meeting, Charlie asked me if I would like an Irishman in the family, and I welcomed him with open arms. Flo asked, "How soon can we have the wedding?" And my answer was, "How soon do you want it?" This was sometime in June, and the date was set for August 29, 1964. Certainly no more time than we really needed to make all the arrangements for the church, reception hall, photographer, wedding invitations, caterers, and what else goes with a respectable wedding. Charlie picked the Presbyterian Church in Grimsby, and Flo chose the Redwood Inn at Tapleytown for the reception. No trouble for Charlie to find a minister, Reverend Thompson, from his own church. Allen Brothers of Hamilton were the caterers. Apart from the $1,000 cost, which we could ill afford, the worst aspect of the wedding was the fact that they had picked a date that corresponded precisely with the Bartlett pear harvest, a busy time on the farm. Patricia Christie and Norma were bridesmaids, and Judy was maid of honor. Charlie's brother was best man, and two of Charlie's friends, Tom Hunt and Bob Young, were also in the party. The weatherman cooperated nicely, and the wedding ceremony went like clockwork. We had our Hammond organ at the reception, and a friend from our Hammond Club, Reg Hammersley, drove from London to play the beautiful music during the banquet. During the usual banging of glasses to signal the groom to kiss the bride, Charlie rose to his feet with great dignity and firmly announced that it was not custom of the man and his family to kiss their wives in public. To say the least, it put a damper on the frivolities that might have followed. They had a short honeymoon in the cabin near Haliburton, Ontario, and returned to live in a house on Van Sickle Street in St. Catharines. About 2 months later, Charlie accepted a charge to preach in the Presbyterian Church in Bruce, near Windsor. Our occasional trips to Bruce within the next little while allowed us to see that all was not well with their marriage. As time passed, their differences multiplied until finally they decided that they should talk it over with someone. We were privileged to be chosen as mediators. What a disappointing experience to hear the many things about which they could not agree. We listened intently as each presented their side of a really serious debate, and I am now ashamed to say that Charlie's well-chosen words convinced me that Flo was almost entirely wrong. I had made no allowances for his superior eloquence or for her lack of control for her pent-up emotions. Mother spent a few days in Bruce, and her report at home was anything but favorable. It was not difficult to detect how hard it was to say harsh words about Florence, the apple of her eye. Then, in an attempt to make Charlie prove that he loved her, Flo made friends with a neighboring farmer's son to make him jealous. She drove tractor on the farm and even brought him here to pick up Norma and visit Niagara Falls. The whole thing backfired. She arrived home with a few precious belongings in her car, fully expecting that Charlie would phone to invite her to return. He never did. It took about 3 days to learn that Charlie had physically beaten her and had left plenty of bruises, nor was it the first time. Flo stayed with a girlfriend and her husband in St. Catharines for the following few days, I would suspect because it was easier than trying to explain to our friends and neighbors the grim details of her problems. Lib and I made a trip to Puce in a last-ditch effort to smooth things over with Charlie, still believing him to be closer to the right of things than Flo. I think it was just as well that we had not yet learned of the several beatings Flo had received, because there could easily have been some drastic changes in the events at that meeting. Regardless of what had happened between them, there was no way I could have sanctioned brutality. There were no kind words left for Flo in Charlie's mind, and all those sincere expressions of admiration and kindness that flowed from his lips at the wedding, like water from a tap, were completely forgotten. It was only a few days later that I received a letter in which Charlie told me, in no uncertain terms, that it was entirely my fault that he had problems with Flo, because I had not brought her up properly. By this time I had learned of the bruises, and I am sure that Charlie would have no trouble understanding my prompt reply. In a matter of months, Charlie was expelled from the church. I do not know the details, and we heard no more of him for several years. Flo was soon employed on the nursing staff at the General Hospital in Simcoe, about 35 miles southwest of home. Her bubbling ambition and efficiency soon won her an offer to take over the supervisor's job, which she accepted. The house she rented was about 4 miles west of Simcoe, and we had quite a job rounding up enough furniture to make do. No thought of going back to Puce for any of the lovely wedding gifts or required furniture there. Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Carey befriended Flo, and they were a great help in relieving some of the frustrations that followed her unfortunate marriage. Doug was also employed at the same hospital as maintenance man and general handyman. They came home with her on occasion, and I remember them discussing the installation of a new vacuum tube message carrier, which was quite an improvement in efficiency for the hospital. In the fall of 1968, Doug was offered the same job at Stoke Hospital in Hamilton, considerably more responsibility, but also a bigger paycheck, which he was happy to accept. Florence was not long following his example and took on a nursing job in the arthritic ward at Stoke. The Careys rented a house near the hospital, and Flo was invited to move in with them and pay for room and board. End of chapter 21.